Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. Today, I want to share with you a story about the peculiar way destiny works. You see, we often imagine that love arrives on a white horse, accompanied by trumpets and clear skies. But in my experience, and certainly in the story I'm about to tell you, love is just as likely to arrive covered in mud, breathless, and chasing a stubborn mule up the side of a forbidden mountain. This is a story about a man the world decided was a monster, and a woman who was too busy stumbling over her own feet to be afraid of him. It is a story about the wild heart of Red Bluff. To understand this story, you first have to understand the spring of 1,885 inches, the Wyoming Territory. It was the kind of season that makes you believe in miracles. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks, leaving behind a valley that was aggressively, violently green. Wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, bluebells, and arrow-leaf balsam root exploded across the plains like paint thrown by a joyous artist. The air smelled of pine sap and thawing earth. It was beautiful. But down in the town of Red Bluff, the beauty of the season was overshadowed by something folks enjoyed far more than flowers' gossip. The town was buzzing. The subject of their whispers was always the same. He lived 3 miles up, on the jagged spine of the ridge that overlooked the valley. His name was Charles Whitlock. But in the saloon and the sewing circles, they didn't call him Charles. They called him the Savage of the Ridge. The stories about him were as tall as the Tetons. They said he was half Apache and half Shadow. They said he had served as a scout for the army, but that something dark had happened out there in the wilderness, something that turned his heart to stone. The old men on the porch of the general store swore that Charles Whitlock could track a whisper in a thunderstorm. They claimed his glare was so cold it could sour fresh milk from 50 paces. But mostly, they said he hated company. They said he guarded his water rights like a dragon guards gold, and that any soul foolish enough to step onto his land would likely never step off of it again. He was a ghost story used to frighten children into behaving. "Eat your vegetables," mothers would say, or Charles Whitlock will come down from the ridge. But fear is a luxury for the wealthy, and Elisa Crow could no longer afford luxuries. Elisa was 24 years old, which, in Red Bluff, made her something of a curiosity. She wasn't married. She wasn't quiet. And she certainly wasn't graceful. She was the former schoolteacher, recently let go because she spent too much time telling the children stories about cloud castles instead of teaching them arithmetic. She was a woman who talked to birds, tripped over flat surfaces, and possessed an optimism that baffled her neighbors. But that optimism was wearing thin. Her father, a good man with bad luck, was drowning in debt. The bank, run by a man named Cole, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, was threatening to take their small, sagging home. Cole didn't care about their history. He only cared about the ledger. Elisa had exactly one asset left in the world. It wasn't jewelry, and it wasn't land. It was Barnaby. Barnaby was a mule, but to call Barnaby a mule was to insult the dignity of mules everywhere. Barnaby was a hairy, four-legged agent of chaos. He was stubborn. He was old. And he had an uncanny ability to sense when Elisa was most stressed, choosing those precise moments to make a run for freedom. And that is exactly what happened on a Tuesday morning in May. Elisa was trying to harness him, hoping to ride into town to beg Cole for an extension on the loan. But Barnaby had other plans. With a snort that sounded suspiciously like laughter, he bolted. He didn't run toward the town, and he didn't run toward the pasture. No. Barnaby ran straight toward the one place in the territory that was strictly forbidden. He ran up the ridge, toward the Whitlock estate. "Barnaby, no," Elisa shouted, hiking up her skirts and sprinting after him. The mule was surprisingly fast. Elisa was not. She scrambled up the deer trail, her boots slipping on the slick, wet clay of the slope. Brambles tore at her hem. Mud splattered her apron. Her hair, which she had pinned up neatly in an attempt to look professional for the banker, came loose, falling in a wild, dark tangle around her face. "You come back here, you traitorous beast," she yelled. Her chest heaving, she chased him for a mile, climbing higher and higher, leaving the safety of the valley behind. The air grew thinner. The trees grew thicker. She was now on Whitlock land. She knew she should turn back. She knew the stories about the savage, but desperation makes us do foolish things. She needed that mule. Finally, she saw him. Barnaby had stopped to graze near a crystal-clear creek that cut through a grove of aspen trees. "Got you," she whispered. Creeping forward, she lunged. Barnaby sidestepped with the grace of a dancer. Elisa did not. Her boot hit a patch of mossy rock, and gravity took over. She didn't just fall. She flew, arms flailing. She pitched forward and landed face first into the freezing snow melt water of the creek. The shock of the cold took her breath away. She scrambled to her hands and knees, sputtering, coughing, wiping slime and wet hair from her eyes. She was soaked to the bone. Her dress was ruined. Her dignity was gone. She looked like a bog creature. "Perfect," she muttered to the water. "Just perfect." And then she realized the birds had stopped singing. A shadow fell over her, a shadow so large it seemed to block out the sun. The water around her knees rippled, not from the current, but from the vibration of heavy hooves hitting the earth. Slowly, dread pooling in her stomach, Elisa looked up. First, she saw boots, worn leather, caked in dust, resting in stirrups. Then, powerful legs clad in dark denim, a rifle scabbard, and finally, she craned her neck all the way back to see the rider. He sat atop a massive black horse that looked like it had been carved out of midnight. The man was terrifying. He was broad-shouldered, with hair as black as a raven's wing tied severely back. But it was his face that froze the air in her lungs. A jagged, pale scar ran down his left cheek, pulling the corner of his eye into a permanent, fierce squint. His skin was bronzed by the sun and his Apache blood, and his expression was harder than the granite of the mountains. It was him, Charles Whitlock. He stared down at her. She was on her knees in his creek, looking like a drowned rat. He looked like a warrior king deciding whether to execute a prisoner. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Barnaby, the traitor, walked over and nuzzled the man's horse, as if they were old friends. Finally, Charles spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling through a canyon. "You're trespassing." Elisa blinked, water dripping from her nose. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But Elisa Crow had a terrible habit. When she was frightened, she couldn't stop her mouth from moving. She wiped a glob of mud from her eye, tilted her chin up defiantly, and blurted out the first thing that came to her mind. "And you," she stammered, "are taller than the rumors." Charles didn't blink. He didn't smile. He just stared at this strange, wet woman who dared to sass him while kneeling in a stream. "And you," he said, his voice flat and unimpressed, "are muddying my drinking water." Elisa wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. This was it. The savage was going to shoot her, or feed her to his horse. She braced herself, waiting for the anger, waiting for him to run her off the mountain. But then, something strange happened. Charles Whitlock sighed. It was a long, weary sound. The sound of a man who just wanted a quiet morning and instead got a mud-soaked schoolteacher. He swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted. He hit the ground with a heavy thud, favoring his right leg. He limped toward the water's edge. Elisa flinched, leaning back, but he didn't reach for his gun. He reached for her. He extended a hand. His palm was calloused and rough, large enough to crush a stone. Elisa stared at it, then tentatively placed her shivering hand in his. With a single, effortless motion, he pulled. He didn't just help her up. He hoisted her out of the creek as if she weighed nothing more than a feather pillow. The sheer physical strength of the man was startling. In 1 second, she was drowning. In the next, she was standing on dry grass, the water pooling around her boots. He didn't let go immediately. He steadied her until she found her footing. Up close, he smelled of sagebrush, leather, and wood smoke. Then, without a word, he turned to Barnaby. The mule flattened his ears, preparing to fight. Charles simply walked up to the beast, grabbed the halter, and stared the mule directly in the eyes. Barnaby froze. It was a battle of wills, and the mule lost in 3 seconds. Charles led the docile animal over to Elisa and handed her the rope. "Take your animal," Charles said, his voice still gruff, though the threat was gone, "and try to stay dry on the way down. The path gets steep." Elisa stood there, shivering, clutching the rope, staring at the back of the man who was supposed to be a monster. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't cursed. He had pulled her from the mud, and as she watched him limp back toward his horse, Elisa Crow realized 2 things. First, the town gossips were liars. And second, she was in a great deal of trouble, because the most terrifying man in Wyoming had just saved her life, and she couldn't remember ever seeing eyes quite that sad. And so, there they stood. The sun was beginning to climb higher, baking the mud on Elisa's skirt into a stiff, gray crust. She was shivering, not just from the cold creek water, but from the sheer adrenaline of standing toe-to-toe with a legend. Most people in Red Bluff would have scrambled down that mountain the moment their feet hit dry land. They would have run until their lungs burned, terrified that the savage might change his mind and reach for his rifle. But Elisa Crow had never been like most people. She was possessed by a curiosity that often overrode her common sense. As Charles turned to lead his horse toward the cabin, Elisa didn't run. She watched. She watched the way he walked. It wasn't just a limp. It was a battle. Every step on his right leg came with a sharp intake of breath, a subtle flinch that rippled through his broad shoulders. He favored the leg heavily, leaning against the black stallion for support when he thought she wasn't looking. She looked past him, to the house itself. The rumors said Charles Whitlock lived in a fortress. The reality was far sadder. It was a cabin that was slowly losing a war against the elements. The porch rail sagged like a tired jaw. The windows were clouded with grit. A bucket lay overturned in the yard, rusted through. It wasn't the lair of a monster. It was the home of a man who was too hurt to care, or perhaps too exhausted to try. Elisa thought of the bank notice sitting on her kitchen table. She thought of Cole's oily smile. She thought of her father, sitting in his chair, staring at walls he was about to lose. Desperation is a powerful illuminator. It clears the fog of fear. "Mr. Whitlock," she called out. Charles stopped. He didn't turn around. His back stiffened, the muscles visible even through his shirt. "Go home, Miss Crow," he rumbled. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "I have a proposition." He turned then. Slowly. The look on his face would have withered a cactus. "I don't buy what peddlers are selling, especially wet ones." "I'm not selling," Elisa said, stepping forward, wringing out the hem of her dress. "I'm trading. You need help. Don't bother denying it. I can see you wince every time you put weight on that leg. Your porch is about to collapse. Your windows are filthy. And if that bucket is any indication, your chickens are probably thirsty." Charles narrowed his eyes, the scar on his cheek crinkling. And I need money," Elisa said flatly. "My father owes the bank. Cole is going to take our house by the end of the month. So, here is the deal. I will cook. I will clean. I will fix that porch I'm handy with a hammer. Surprisingly, I will make this place livable again. In exchange, you pay me enough to keep the wolves from my door." Charles stared at her. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rushing through the pines and the impatient stomp of the black horse. "I don't want help," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I certainly don't want a chatterbox woman under my roof." "I can be quiet," Elisa lied. "And it wouldn't be under your roof at night. I'll come at dawn. I'll leave at dusk. You'll barely know I'm here." He laughed then. A dry, humorless sound. He stepped closer, towering over her, using his height as a weapon. He tilted his head so the light caught the jagged, the pale line of the scar running from his temple to his jaw. It was a brutal mark, a map of violence etched into his skin. "Look at me," he commanded softly. "Do you know why no one comes up here? It isn't just the land. It's me. I am not a man for polite company. I am Half-Apache in a territory that hates my blood. And I am scarred enough to make children cry. You think you can stomach that every day over breakfast?" Elisa didn't flinch. She had spent years teaching children who came to school with bruised knuckles and hungry eyes. She knew that the scariest things were rarely on the outside. She looked him square in the face. She didn't look away from the scar. She looked at it, acknowledged it, and then looked back into his dark, guarded eyes. "I promise not to stare at your scar, Mr. Whitlock," she said softly. "If you promise not to stare at my mud." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, respect. It was gone too fast to tell. He grunted, turning back to his horse. $2 a week," he said over his shoulder. "And if you talk too much, I'll fire you." $3, Elisa countered. "And I'll bring my own soap." He paused at the door of the cabin. "Done. Start tomorrow. Don't be late." The grumpy phase, as Elisa later called it in her diary, began the next morning. If Charles Whitlock thought he could scare Elisa away with silence, he had severely underestimated her tolerance for awkwardness. He was determined to be the beast the town believed him to be. He would storm into the kitchen while she was scrubbing the floor, pour himself coffee without a word, and glare at the wall as if it had insulted his ancestors. He ate his meals in a brooding silence that was heavy enough to crush a lesser woman. He would take the plate she offered, venison stew, usually, and retreat to the corner of the room, eating with his back to her. When she tried to ask him about his day, or how his leg was feeling, he would respond with a series of grunts that ranged from "leave me alone" to "I am contemplating murder." At night, he refused to sleep in the house while she was there finishing up. He retreated to the barn, sleeping in the hayloft like a guard dog, leaving the house to her and the ghosts. He was trying to be terrifying. He was trying to prove that he was unlovable, unhelpably, and better off alone. But Elisa Crow was not easily intimidated. In fact, she found his grumpiness rather manageable. It was predictable. Like the weather. "Good morning, Mr. Whitlock," she would chirp at dawn. Ignoring his scowl, "Humph," he would reply, "I see you're in a sunny mood today. Perfect weather for beating the rugs." She didn't tiptoe around him. She swirled around him. She was a whirlwind of energy that descended upon the dusty, gray mausoleum of his life. She started with the chickens. They were a ragged, pathetic bunch that Charles had clearly ignored for months. Elisa didn't just feed them, she adopted them. "You can't eat a chicken that doesn't have a name," she declared one morning as Charles walked past the coop. "This one is Henrietta. She's the bossy one. That one is Clytemnestra, because she looks tragic. And the rooster is Napoleon." Charles stopped, a bale of hay on his shoulder. "They are livestock, not pets." "Well, Henrietta thinks you're underfeeding her," Elisa replied, scattering corn. "And Napoleon agrees." Charles rolled his eyes. But that evening, Elisa noticed he had repaired the hole in the chicken wire. The house began to change. The silence that Charles had carefully cultivated was broken, shattered, really, by the sound of humming. Elisa hummed constantly. She hummed while she swept. She hummed while she polished the silver that had been tarnished black. She hummed, off-key, fractured melodies that drifted through the open windows and settled in the rafters. Charles would be out in the yard, chopping wood, and he would hear it. A slice of a hymn, or a bar shanty, drifting out to him. He would pause, axe in midair, and shake his head, but he didn't shout for her to stop. Of course, it wasn't all perfect. Elisa was, by nature, a disaster with feet. On the third day, she tripped over the hearth rug and sent a pot of boiling water cascading across the floor. On the fifth day, she tried to make a fancy French stew she had read about in a book. It resulted in a black, smoking sludge that stuck to the bottom of the pot, like tar. Charles came in from the cold, hungry and tired, to find the kitchen filled with smoke, and Elisa frantically waving a towel. "I ruined it," she wailed, her face smudged with soot. "It was supposed to be boeuf bourguignon, but I think it's just boeuf burnt." Charles looked at the pot. He looked at Elisa, who looked ready to cry. He could have yelled. He could have told her she was incompetent, that this was why he lived alone. Instead, he walked over to the pantry, pulled out a jar of preserved peaches, and set it on the table. "Stew is overrated," he said gruffly. Elisa looked at him, wide-eyed. "I can make biscuits," she whispered. "I'm good at biscuits." "Then make biscuits," he said, sitting down. And open a window before we both suffocate. She made the biscuits. They were golden, fluffy, and tasted like heaven. They ate them with the peaches, sitting at the small wooden table. For the first time, Charles didn't turn his back to her. He watched her eat, watching the way she savored the sweetness. And for the first time in 4 years, the knot of anger in his chest loosened. Just a fraction. As the weeks turned into a month, the arrangement shifted. It wasn't a transaction anymore. It was a rhythm. The sensory landscape of Charles Whitlock's life was being rewritten. For years, his world had smelled of horse sweat, stale tobacco, and dust. It was a dry, lonely smell. Now, the cabin smelled of lemon oil and beeswax. It smelled of rising dough and dried lavender that Elisa hung in bundles from the ceiling beams. It smelled of life, but the true shift happened in the evenings. Elisa would stay later now. Sometimes, until after the sun had dipped below the ridge. To finish the mending. The evenings were long and quiet. And one night, the silence felt too heavy for Elisa to bear. She pulled a small, dog-eared book from her apron pocket. It was a dime novel, cheap, sensational fiction printed on pulp paper, with a lurid cover depicting a fainting woman and a masked bandit. Charles was sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar. He looked up as she cleared her throat. "I'm going to read," she announced. "Since you aren't much for conversation, I prefer the quiet." He grunted. "Well, I prefer The Bandit Queen of Laramie," she retorted. She began to read. Her voice was clear and expressive. She didn't just read the words, she performed them. She did a breathy, high-pitched voice for the heroine and a low, gravelly growl for the villain. It was ridiculous. It was trash. It was the furthest thing from the literature Charles had been educated on by his white father. He hated it. Or so he told himself. "This is nonsense." He interrupted after 10 minutes. "No bandit would hide in a well. It's tactically unsound. He'd be trapped. It's romantic." "Charles," Elisa said, not looking up. "He's hiding there to hear the heroine's secret confession. He's going to drown," Charles muttered, but he didn't leave the room. The next night, when Elisa finished her chores, she didn't reach for the book immediately. She sat by the fire, resting her eyes. Charles cleared his throat. He shifted in his chair. He poked the fire unnecessarily. Finally, he spoke, his voice sounding rusty. Did the idiot get out of the well?" Elisa smiled. She didn't look at him, didn't want to spook him, but her smile was blinding. She pulled the book out. "As a matter of fact," she said, opening to page 42. "He was just about to." And so, a routine was born. Every night, the fire would crackle. The wind would howl outside the sturdy logs of the cabin. And Elisa Crow would read to the monster of the ridge. She read him stories of impossible love and daring escapes. And Charles, the man who had seen the worst of humanity, the man who had frozen his heart to survive, sat in the shadows and listened. He watched the firelight dance on her face. He watched the way her brow furrowed when the story got tense. He listened to the cadence of her voice. And he realized with a terrifying jolt that he wasn't listening to the story anymore. He was listening to her. The domestic intimacy of it was seductive. It was a trap. It felt like playing house, like pretending they were a family. It was the smell of baking bread replacing the smell of dust. It was the sound of a woman's voice replacing the ringing silence of isolation. One evening, Elisa fell asleep in the chair mid-chapter. The book slipped from her fingers. Charles sat there for a long time, just watching her breathe. He stood up, his bad leg protesting, and walked over to her. He didn't wake her. He picked up the woolen blanket from the sofa and draped it over her, tucking the edges in with a gentleness that his large, scarred hands shouldn't have possessed. "Foolish girl," he whispered to the sleeping woman. "You're making it very hard for me to stay a monster." He picked up the dime novel from the floor, marked the page, and set it on the table. Then he went out to the porch to watch the stars, terrified by the realization that, for the first time in his life, he was afraid of the sun coming up, because sunrise meant she would leave, and he wasn't sure he remembered how to be alone. Summer in Wyoming is a deceptive creature. It beguiles you with long, golden days and skies, so blue they look painted on, only to turn violent in the span of a single heartbeat. It was late July when the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and pine resin. The birds stopped singing first, a silence that fell over the ridge like a heavy blanket. Then came the wind, stripping leaves from the aspens and bending the lodgepole pines until they groaned in protest. Charles Whitlock knew this weather. He respected it. But when a bolt of lightning, jagged and white-hot, struck an ancient pine on the western perimeter, shattering it and sending it crashing through the fence line, respect had to give way to necessity. That fence held his small herd of cattle, the only thing besides the water rights that kept the estate solvent. If they scattered into the storm, he would lose them to the canyons. He didn't wait for the rain. He grabbed his coat, pulled his hat low, and limped toward the barn. His leg, always stiffer when the pressure dropped, burned with a dull, throbbing ache. He ignored it. He had spent a lifetime ignoring pain. It was the only way he knew how to walk. Elisa was in the kitchen, frantically trying to close the shutters against the rising gale. "Charles," she called out, the wind snatching the name from her lips. "You can't go out in this. Fence is down." He yelled back, not stopping. "Stay inside." He rode out into the teeth of the storm. The rain began to fall, not in drops, but in sheets, turning the dry dust of the ridge into a slick, treacherous slurry of clay. He reached the break in the fence just as the cattle began to mill about. Nervous and eyeing the gap, he dismounted, his boots sliding in the mud. He grabbed the heavy railing, wrestling the splintered wood with gritty desperation. He was a strong man, his shoulders broad and capable. But the earth beneath him had no loyalty. As he heaved the log into place, his good foot slipped. His weight shifted violently onto his bad leg, the leg that had been shattered years ago and held together by sheer will. There was a sickening pop. A flash of white agony blinded him. His knee buckled, giving way completely. And Charles Whitlock, the savage of the ridge, collapsed into the mud with a cry that was swallowed instantly by the thunder. He tried to stand. He couldn't. The pain was a living thing, clawing up his thigh, stealing his breath. He lay there, rain hammering against his face, mud seeping into his clothes, realizing with a cold dread that he was trapped. He was miles from the house, hidden by the storm. And for the first time in years, he felt truly helplessly small. But he had forgotten one variable. He had forgotten that he was no longer the only ghost haunting this ridge. He didn't hear her approach over the roar of the wind. He only felt hands small, urgent hands, grabbing the collar of his coat. "Charles, get up." He blinked, wiping rain from his eyes. Elisa was there. Her hair was plastered to her skull, her dress soaked through, her face pale with fear, but set with a determination that rivaled the storm. She had followed him. Of course, she had followed him. "I can't," he gritted out, the shame burning hotter than the injury. "Legs gone, then crawl," she ordered. She didn't offer pity. She didn't wring her hands. She jammed her shoulder under his armpit, bracing her small frame against his massive weight. "Lean on me. We are not dying in the mud." Charles Whitlock. I refused to explain that to the chickens. It was an agonizing mile back to the cabin. Every step was a battle. Elisa strained under his weight, her boots slipping, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But she never let go. She became his crutch, his anchor. When they finally crashed through the door of the cabin, they collapsed onto the rug in a heap of wet wool and exhaustion. The fire had burned low, but the warmth was immediate. Charles lay back, squeezing his eyes shut, waiting for the humiliation to recede. It didn't. He was the protector. He was the monster who scared the town. And here he was, shivering on the floor, rescued by a schoolteacher who talked to mules. "We need to get you dry," Elisa said. Her voice was shaking, but her hands were steady. She moved efficiently, stoking the fire, grabbing towels. She knelt beside him. "And I need to see the leg." "No," Charles said sharply. He grabbed her wrist. "Leave it." "Charles," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "You are freezing. And you are hurt. Let go." He released her. He watched warily as she took a knife from the table and slit the seam of his denim trousers, peeling the wet fabric away from the skin. She sucked in a breath. It wasn't just the fresh swelling that shocked her. It was the old scars. His leg was a roadmap of trauma-twisted skin, deep indentations where muscle had been torn away. The brutal evidence of the war that had supposedly made him a savage. It was ugly. It was mangled. Charles turned his face toward the fire, jaw clenched, waiting for the flinch, waiting for the revulsion. But he felt only warmth. Elisa had taken a warm cloth and was gently, methodically cleaning the mud from the ruined skin. Her touch wasn't fearful. It was reverent. She wrapped the swelling with clean linen, her fingers brushing against the rough scar tissue with a tenderness that made his chest ache more than his knee. "Why do you stay?" The words left his mouth before he could stop them. They hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Elisa paused, her hands resting on his shin. She looked up. Her eyes were dark and unreadable in the firelight. "What?" she whispered. "Why do you stay?" Charles repeated, his voice rough. He gestured vaguely to the door, to the town below, to the world that made sense. "The pay isn't enough for this. The work is hard. And the town. I know what they say. They laugh at you. They say you're up here with the monster. They say I'll hurt you." He looked at her, searching for the lie, searching for the pity. Why endure the ridicule? Elisa, why stay with a broken man who can't even fix a fence without falling down? Elisa sat back on her heels. She looked at the fire, then back at him. A small, Sad smile touched her lips. "Let them laugh," she said softly. "They don't know." She reached out, ignoring his flinch, and placed her hand over his heart. "They don't know that the monster saves spiders from the water bucket instead of crushing them," she said. "They don't know that he secretly listens to dime novels about bandit queens. And they don't know that he likes cinnamon in his coffee, because it reminds him of his mother's kitchen." Charles stopped breathing. "I don't stay for the money, Charles," she whispered. "And I don't stay for the view. I stay because, when I fell in the creek, you didn't laugh. You pulled me out. And I think everyone deserves to be pulled out of the mud once in a while." The silence that followed was different than the silence of the empty house. It was a loaded silence, thick with things that were too terrifying to say aloud. Charles looked at her, really looked at her, and realized with a sudden, piercing clarity that she wasn't seeing the scar. She wasn't seeing the Apache blood that the town hated. She wasn't seeing the limp. She was seeing him. She had memorized his coffee order. She had noticed the spiders. She had catalogued the small, hidden parts of his soul that he thought had withered away years ago. He closed his eyes, and a single tear, hot and traitorous, slipped down his cheek to vanish into the scar. "Thank you," he choked out. "You're welcome," she said simply. "Now drink your soup. It has cinnamon in it." The storm broke by morning, leaving the world washed clean and glittering. But the thaw inside the cabin had only just begun. Charles was confined to the house for a week while his knee healed. In the past, this confinement would have made him unbearable, a caged animal pacing and growling. But something had shifted in the night. The anger had drained out of him, replaced by a quiet, watchful softness. He began to do small things, silent things. Elisa would arrive in the morning to find the fire already lit, the heavy logs stacked perfectly so she wouldn't have to lift them. One afternoon, Elisa went to the barn to check on Barnaby. She found the mule sporting a new halter, the leather oiled and supple, and resting on a fence post was a small object. She picked it up. It was a wood carving. It was Barnaby. But it wasn't just a generic mule. It was her mule. Charles had captured the stubborn set of the ears, the knobby knees, the ridiculous expression of perpetual annoyance. It was carved with exquisite delicacy, sanded smooth until it felt like silk. She turned to the house, holding the wooden mule to her chest, her heart doing a frantic, joyful rhythm against her ribs. And then there were the flowers. It started subtly. A sprig of sage on the windowsill, a handful of bluebells in a jar by the wash basin. Charles never mentioned them. If she asked, he would shrug and mutter about clearing weeds. But one evening, after a long day of canning peaches, Elisa walked into the main room to find the table set for dinner. In the center, in a small crystal vase that had belonged to his mother, stood a single, perfect red wildflower. It was an Indian paintbrush, the fiery symbol of the Wyoming prairie. It was wild. It was resilient. And it was beautiful. Elisa touched the petals, her fingers trembling. She looked up to find Charles standing in the doorway, leaning on a cane he had carved himself. He wasn't scowling. He wasn't looking away. He was watching her, his dark eyes unguarded and warm. "It matches your spirit," he said quietly. He didn't say, "I love you." He didn't say, "You saved me." He didn't have the words for that yet. But in the language of wood carvings, cinnamon, coffee, and wildflowers, He was shouting it from the rooftops. The winter of his soul was over. The thaw had come, and the wild heart of Red Bluff was beating again. Happiness, for a man like Charles Whitlock, was a suspicious thing. It felt fragile, like thin ice on a spring pond, beautiful to look at, but treacherous to stand on. For weeks, he had been standing on that ice, letting himself believe it might hold. He had let the warmth of Elisa's laughter seep into the cold stone of his life. He had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't entirely made of sharp edges. But the world has a way of reminding you who you are, especially when you start to forget. It happened on a Tuesday. Elisa had gone down to town for supplies: flour, sugar, and a new spool of ribbon she claimed was for her hair, but Charles suspected was for the mule. The cabin was quiet, but it was a good quiet, the kind that waits for a door to open. Charles was on the porch, sanding a new rocking chair he had been secretly building, when he saw the dust cloud rising from the valley floor. It wasn't Elisa's mule. It was a carriage, black, polished, and pulled by two expensive bays. It moved up the switchbacks like a beetle crawling up a wall. Charles set down his sandpaper. The old instinct, the one that had kept him alive in the Apache Wars, prickled at the base of his neck. He reached for his rifle, leaning it against the rail, and waited. The carriage stopped at the gate. The man who stepped out was dressed in a suit that cost more than Charles's entire herd. He wore a bowler hat and a smile that looked like it had been practiced in a mirror. It was Cole, the banker, the man who owned half of Red Bluff and wanted the other half. "Mr. Whitlock," Cole called out, smoothing his lapels. "A pleasure to finally see the view from up here. It is expansive. State your business," Charles said, not moving from the shadows of the porch. Cole chuckled, opening the gate. He walked with the confidence of a man who held the deed to the ground he walked on. "Business. Can't a neighbor pay a call I heard you've had?" "Company. A Miss Crow, I believe." Charles stiffened. "She works for me. That's all." "Works for you." Cole stopped at the foot of the stairs. He looked up, his eyes gleaming with a malicious kind of pity. "Is that what she told you? That she just wandered up here looking for work? Get to the point." "Cole," Charles growled. "The point, Charles, is that Elisa Crow is a lovely girl. But she is a desperate girl." Cole reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He waved it gently. "Her father owes my bank a significant sum. Foreclosure was imminent. We had a discussion about it." Charles felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "What discussion?" "I told her I needed someone on the inside." Cole lied. It was a smooth lie, wrapped in a grain of truth. "I told her I needed to know about your water rights, about the deed. I told her if she could get close to the savage of the ridge, get him to trust her, get him to soften up, I might forgive her father's debt." He paused, letting the poison sink in. "She's a good actress, isn't she? The clumsiness, the charm, the biscuits." It was all very convincing. But then again, desperation makes wonderful liars of us all. Charles felt the blood drain from his face. The ice he had been standing on shattered. "Get out," Charles whispered. Cole tipped his hat. "I'm just looking out for you. Son de Flive. People like us. We have to be careful. We can't afford to believe in fairy tales." He left the paper on the railing, a ledger showing the Crow family debt, and walked away. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the seed had been planted in fertile soil. For an hour, Charles sat there. He stared at the ledger. He stared at the rocking chair he had made for her. The doubt, which had been sleeping, woke up roaring. Of course. The voice in his head whispered, "Look at you. You are scarred. You are broken. Why would a woman like her want you?" She wanted the house. She wanted the money. She was acting. Every smile, every touch, every moment of kindness twisted in his memory until it looked like a betrayal. When Elisa returned an hour later, humming a tune, carrying a basket of apples, she found the cabin dark. "Charles," she called out, stepping into the main room, "I got the best apples." And I saw Mrs. Higgins. And she asked if. She stopped. Charles was standing by the fireplace. His back was to her. The air in the room was so cold it felt like winter had returned in July. "Charles," she asked, her voice trembling, "what's wrong?" He turned. The warmth was gone from his eyes. The winter had returned, harder and crueler than before. He looked at her not with love, but with a terrifying, blank indifference. "You're late," he said. The wagon wheel stuck. She stammered. "Charles, you're scaring me." "Am I?" He laughed. A harsh, jagged sound. "I thought you were brave. I thought you weren't afraid of the monster." He walked to the table. There was a heavy leather pouch sitting there. He picked it up. Cole was here. Charles said, "Elisa Froza." "Cole. Why?" "He told me about the debt." Charles said, "He told me about the deal." Charles. "No." Elisa stepped forward, her hands reaching out. "I owe the bank." "Yes. But I never made a deal with him. I came here to work. I came here because you were sent," he roared. The sound shook the rafters. "Because you needed to get close to the savage to save your father's skin. It was a job. A performance." "It wasn't," Elisa cried, tears springing to her eyes. "Maybe at first, maybe the first day I needed the money, but not after. Not for a long time." "Lies." Charles spat. He couldn't hear her. He wouldn't let himself hear her. If he believed her, and she was lying, it would kill him. It was safer to burn it down now. He hefted the bag of gold coins, his savings, his safety, and threw it. It hit the floor at her feet with a heavy, final crash. The sound of metal hitting wood echoed like a gunshot. "There," he said, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "That's enough to pay your father's debt and then some. You did your job. You tamed the beast. Now take your pay and get out." Elisa looked down at the bag. Then she looked up at him. Her face was pale, streaked with tears. But she didn't cower. She straightened her spine. The clumsy, chattering girl was gone. In her place stood a woman with a heart of iron. "You think I did this for money?" she asked softly. "Everyone does everything for money," Charles said, turning his back on her. "Go." Elisa stood there for a long moment. She looked at the gold. She could have taken it. It would have solved all her problems. It would have saved her father. But she stepped over the bag. "I felt sorry for you at first," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I thought you were lonely. I thought you were misunderstood." She walked to the door, her hand resting on the latch. But Cole was right about one thing. "Charles, you are a savage. Not because of your blood, and not because of your scar, but because you would rather be right about your misery than risk being loved. She opened the door. The wind howled outside. "Keep your money," she said. "I didn't do this for the gold. Not for a long time. I did it because I loved you. But I won't love a man who thinks I can be bought." The door slammed. Charles didn't move. He stood facing the fire, his knuckles white as he gripped the mantle. He waited for the sound of the mule's hooves to fade away down the mountain. Only when the silence returned absolute, suffocating, ringing silence did he turn around. The room was empty. The bag of gold lay on the floor, untouched, mocking him. On the table, the basket of apples sat where she had left it, and next to it, the wooden mule he had carved for her. He walked over and picked up the carving. It was warm from the fire. He had won. He had protected himself. He had driven out the spy. He sank into the chair, the one she usually sat in, and buried his face in his hands. The silence pressed in on his ears, louder than any scream. It wasn't peace. It wasn't safety. It was a grave. And he had just buried the only living thing that had ever bloomed in it. Silence is dangerous, but a whisper started by a rich man is lethal. Down in Red Bluff, the whisper had turned into a roar. Cole stood on the steps of the sheriff's office, his voice trembling with practiced concern. He spoke of public safety. He spoke of a madman on the ridge, a savage who had threatened a banker, a man who was stockpiling weapons and losing his mind. He waved the ledger, the debt Elisa's father owed, as proof of Charles's instability, twisting the truth until it looked like a noose. "We have a duty," Cole shouted to the gathering crowd, "to protect this town before he comes down here and hurts someone." The mob didn't need much convincing. Fear is a dry tinder, and Cole had the match. They gathered their courage, their pitchforks, and their guns, and they started up the mountain. Elisa was at the livery stable, saddling Barnaby for a long ride to nowhere. When she heard them, she heard the anger in their voices. She heard Charles's name spoken with venom. She didn't think. She didn't calculate the risk. She didn't remember the bag of gold he had thrown at her feet or the cruel words he had spoken to drive her away. She only remembered the man who had carved a wooden mule by firelight. She didn't run away from the danger. She ran directly into it. She took the deer trail, the steep, treacherous path that only she and the mule knew. Her lungs burned. Branches whipped her face. But she pushed Barnaby harder than she ever had, racing the setting sun and the angry dust cloud of the mob on the main road. She reached the cabin just as the sheriff and 20 men crested the rise. Charles was already there. He stood on the porch, his rifle leveled at the chest of the sheriff. He looked exactly like the monster they wanted him to be. His eyes were cold, his jaw set in granite, his finger tightening on the trigger. He was ready to die. He had accepted that this was how it would end alone, fighting a world that hated him. "Drop it, Whitlock," the sheriff yelled. "It's over. Come and take it." Charles growled back. The tension was a pulled bowstring, ready to snap. And then, a whirlwind in a torn dress burst from the trees. "Stop." Elisa didn't run to the sheriff. She ran to the porch. She threw herself between the mob and the rifle, planting her feet in the dust. Her arms spread wide. "Elisa!" "Move!" Charles shouted, his voice cracking with sudden, terrifying fear. "Get out of the line of fire." "No," she screamed back, facing the crowd. She looked at the faces of men she had known her whole life. The baker, the blacksmith, the fathers of children she had taught. "Look at yourselves," she cried, her voice ringing clear and fierce across the yard. "You come up here with guns to hunt a man you don't even know. You call him a savage. You call him a beast." She pointed a shaking finger at the sheriff. "He fixed your fence last winter when you were sick. Sheriff, he left the wood by your gate in the middle of the night so you wouldn't have to thank him." She turned to the blacksmith. "And you, when your daughter was lost in the storm 2 years ago, who found her, you said it was a miracle. It wasn't a miracle. It was Charles. He carried her 3 miles in the snow and left her at your door because he knew you'd be too proud to take help from an Indian." The mob shifted. Feet shuffled in the dirt. "I lived in this house," Elisa said, her voice dropping to a hush that carried more weight than a scream. "I saw him every day. He saves spiders from the water bucket. He carves toys for mules. He listens to stories." She looked directly at Cole, her eyes blazing. "You see a savage, because it's easier than admitting you see a better man than any of you." Silence fell over the ridge. The shame was palpable. It hung in the air, heavier than the rifle in Charles's hands. Slowly, agonizingly, slowly, Charles lowered the gun. He looked at the back of Elisa's head, at the messy hair, the trembling shoulders of the woman who had just used her own body as a shield for him. He stepped off the porch. He walked past her, close enough to brush her arm. He walked straight up to Cole, who was suddenly looking very small. Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a deed. "You want the land?" Charles asked softly. "You want the rights?" He shoved the paper into Cole's chest. "Take it. It's the deed to the rocky strip on the north face, the one with the shale and the rattlesnake nests. It's all yours." Cole stared at the paper, his face turning a blotchy red. "But the water rights belong to the valley," Charles said, his voice hard as iron. "And the valley stays with the cabin." He turned his back on Cole. He turned his back on the mob. He walked back to Elisa, who was still standing there, breathing hard, waiting for him to send her away again. He stopped in front of her. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about the town or the gossip or the past. He took her hands in his. "Take the rock." "Cole," Charles said over his shoulder, his eyes never leaving Elisa's face. "I'm keeping the valley, and I'm keeping the girl." The crowd didn't leave all at once. They drifted away like smoke in a strong wind. Heads bowed, eyes fixed on their boots. Shame is a heavy coat to wear, especially when it's stitched together by your own neighbors. Cole was the last to go. He stood there for a moment, clutching the deed to the north ridge, a piece of paper that gave him ownership of nothing but shale rock and a rattlesnake den. He looked at the cabin, then at the man and woman standing on the porch. And finally, he turned his expensive boots toward the road. He had come for a kingdom, but he left with a handful of dust. When the last wagon wheel creaked out of sight, the silence returned to the ridge. But it wasn't the hollow, lonely silence that Charles had known for 4 years. It was the quiet of a storm that had finally passed. The sun began to dip below the Tetons, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and gold. Charles leaned his rifle against the wall, a weapon he hoped never to pick up again, and turned to Elisa. She was still trembling, the adrenaline of her defense slowly fading into the cool evening air. She looked at him, waiting. Charles reached out and took her hands. They were small in his, rough from work, and utterly perfect. "I am not an easy man, Elisa," he said, his voice low and raspy. I have ghosts that walk these halls. I have a leg that will never run, and a face that stops conversations. I am half shadow. Elisa squeezed his hands. She didn't look away. She didn't try to smooth his hair or fix his collar. She just smiled. That same bright, defiant smile that had challenged him in the creek all those months ago. Good, she whispered. Because I am too loud. I burn the stew. And as you know, I trip over air. We balance. He pulled her close then, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of rain and resilience. They sat on the steps of the porch as the first stars pricked the canopy of the night. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The roof still leaked. The fence still needed fixing. The world was still hard. But they were together. And for the first time in a long time, the savage of the ridge wasn't watching the horizon for enemies. He was watching the woman beside him. And he was happy, my friends. As we close the book on Charles and Elisa, I want you to take a moment to think about the walls we build around our own hearts. We live in a world that demands perfection. We are told to hide our scars, to cover our pain, to present a polished version of ourselves to the neighbors. But this story teaches us a different truth. Love does not look for perfection. It does not look for a face without scars or a past without pain. Love is simply the courage to let someone see the broken parts of you, and finding that they do not look away. In the end, Charles Whitlock didn't need to be fixed. He just needed to be found. And Elisa didn't need to be graceful. She just needed to be brave enough to love a man the world had thrown away. So, I have to ask you, what did you think of Elisa's choice? Would you have stood in front of that gun? And where are you listening from tonight? Are you watching the sunset in Arizona? Or having your morning coffee in Maine? I want to hear your story. Please, leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of second chances, please hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who might need a reminder that they are worthy of love, just as they are. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and ring that bell. Join our tribe here at Eagle Eye Apache, where we believe that every scar tells a story, and every story is worth telling. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your heart open to the wild.